The late afternoon sun filtered through the crystalline windows of Gabriel Martinez's glassworks, casting prismatic shadows across the dusty floor of his workshop in the heart of Serpent's Pass. The master glassmaker's weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he manipulated molten glass with his blowpipe, each breath and subtle movement born from decades of experience. His latest piece, a delicate vase commissioned by the town's bank manager, slowly took shape under his expert touch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rainbow-hued reflections dancing across his workshop's walls belied the utilitarian nature of most of his work. While the wealthy citizens of Serpent's Pass might occasionally commission decorative pieces, Gabriel's bread and butter came from crafting sturdy windows, reliable bottles, and practical glassware for the growing settlement. The town, nestled in a narrow valley between towering cliffs, had grown significantly since he'd arrived 5 years ago, seeking anonymity among its hard-working residents. The steady rhythm of his work was interrupted by approaching hoofbeats. Through the warped glass of his workshop windows, Gabriel watched 3 riders emerge from the shimmering heat waves rising off the desert floor. Their horses were fine animals, too fine for common drifters, but their riders carried themselves with the casual menace of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Gabriel carefully placed his blowpipe in its rest, the half-formed vase still, glowing with inner heat. His movements were unhurried as he wiped his hands on his leather apron, eyes noting how the men's gun belts rode low on their hips, tied down for quick draws. More telling was the way they surveyed his workshop, not with the curiosity of potential customers, but with the calculated assessment of men looking for something specific. "You the glassmaker?" the leader called out, swinging down from his saddle. He was a tall man with a face marked by a distinctive scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw, the kind of wound that spoke of close, desperate fighting. Gabriel recognized the look in his eyes, the predatory gleam of someone used to others cowering before him. "That would be me," Gabriel replied, his voice carrying the slight accent of his Mexican heritage despite decades north of the border. He stayed near his workbench, where the tools of his trade lay within easy reach. Long metal rods, heavy shears, and blocks of various sizes. Simple implements for shaping glass, though in practiced hands, anything could become a weapon. The scarred man introduced himself as Marcus Cole, though Gabriel suspected that wasn't the name he'd been born with. His companions spread out slightly as they entered the workshop, one positioning himself near the door, while the other drifted toward the storage area where completed pieces waited for delivery. "Heard tell, you're the only glassmaker between here and Santa Fe," Cole said, running a finger along the edge of a cooling tray. "They say you do exceptional work, precise work." The emphasis he placed on the last words carried clear meaning. Gabriel kept his expression neutral as he responded, "People say many things. I make windows, bottles, the occasional decorative piece. Nothing exceptional about honest work." The man by the door snorted. "Honest work? What do you call what you did for the Union Army during the war, or maybe what you did after for certain private interests?" Gabriel's hand stilled for just a moment, the only indication that the words had struck home. It had been 15 years since he'd last worked with the specialized glass that had made him both famous and infamous in certain circles. 15 years later, he'd sworn off creating the precision lenses and crystal mechanisms that had transformed simple firearms into weapons of terrifying accuracy and power. "Don't know what you're talking about," Gabriel said evenly, turning back to his cooling vase. "The war's long over. I shoe horses, fix wagons, do honest work for honest pay." Cole moved closer, his boot heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Everything's got a price, old man. Name yours." His hand rested casually on his gun belt, the threat clear but unstated. "Already did," Gabriel replied, meeting Cole's gaze steadily. "Said I don't do that kind of work anymore. That's my price." The atmosphere in the workshop grew heavy with tension, the afternoon light fracturing through Gabriel's creations to cast strange patterns across the faces of the men facing each other. The man by the storage area picked up a delicate glass bird, pretending to study it while his other hand stayed near his holster. "Maybe you need some motivation," Cole suggested, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is a nice setup. You got here. Would be a shame if something happened to it, or to that pretty school teacher who brings you lunch every Wednesday." Before Gabriel could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Everything's all right here, Mr. Martinez?" Sheriff Sarah Hawkins stood in the doorway, her badge catching the light streaming through the windows. She was young for a law officer, but her eyes held the steady look of someone who'd earned their position through more than just quick shooting. More importantly, Gabriel knew she was smarter than most gave her credit for, and far more dangerous. Cole's demeanor changed instantly, a smile spreading across his scarred face. "Just having a friendly chat with the Glassmaker here, Sheriff, about some repair work." Hawkins studied the three men, her hand resting casually near her gun. "Serpent's Pass is a peaceful town, gentlemen. Let's keep it that way." The three men backed away, but Cole paused at the door. "We'll be back tomorrow to continue our discussion, Mr. Martinez, about that repair work." After they left, Hawkins turned to Gabriel, concern etched on her features. "You all right, old-timer? Those men seemed awfully interested in your glass work." Gabriel had already returned to his vase, but his movements were more forceful now, less precise. "Nothing I can't handle, Sarah. Been dealing with their kind since before you were born." "I know who they are," Hawkins said quietly, moving closer to avoid being overheard. "Marcus Cole and his gang. 3 train robberies in the last month, and those are just the ones we know about. Word is, they're planning something big." Gabriel nodded, letting the rhythmic motions of his craft fill the silence. "Then you best keep an eye on the bank," he said finally. "Men like that, they always follow the money." As Hawkins left, Isabella Reyes approached the shop carrying her usual basket of fresh tamales and beans. The young schoolteacher had made it her habit to bring Gabriel dinner, claiming someone needed to make sure he ate properly. She'd witnessed the exchange from across the street, and something about the way the old Glassmaker had handled himself, the stillness, the control, the underlying tension, made her wonder what secrets lay beneath his quiet exterior. "Mr. Martinez," she called softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of his work, "is this a bad time?" Gabriel looked up, his expression softening slightly. Isabella was one of the few people in town who treated him like more than just the local craftsman, taking time to learn about his art and share stories of her own family's journey north from Mexico. "Never a bad time for you, Miss Reyes." "What's troubling you?" She set her basket down, her dark eyes serious. "Those men, they seem dangerous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." A grim smile touched Gabriel's weathered face. "Most men who try to look dangerous usually aren't, Miss Reyes. It's the quiet ones you need to watch out for." He paused, testing the strength of a newly cooled piece. "Always the quiet ones." Something in his voice made Isabella wonder just how quiet Gabriel Martinez really was, and what fires burned beneath that carefully maintained silence. As the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, casting the workshop into shadow, the steady sound of his work continued, each carefully controlled breath shaping not just glass, but the boundary between the peace he'd found and the violence he'd left behind, or so he thought. Evening cast long shadows through the workshop's crystalline windows, transforming Gabriel's simple glassworks into a kaleidoscope of colors. He worked later than usual, his practiced hands shaping a series of small, seemingly ordinary glass spheres. But these weren't the simple marbles he sometimes made for the town's children. Each one contained precisely carved internal patterns that only revealed themselves when held to the light at specific angles. Isabella had lingered after bringing dinner, grading papers at her usual spot while watching him work. The steady rhythm of his breathing as he shaped the molten glass had become as familiar to her as the school bell, though tonight something felt different about his technique. "Mr. Martinez," she ventured, setting aside a student's essay, "where did you learn to work with glass like this?" Gabriel's hands stilled for a moment as he studied the sphere he'd just completed. "My father was a glassmaker in Guadalajara," he began, his voice distant with memory, "but the techniques I use—" He gestured to the intricate patterns hidden within the cooling sphere. "These I learned elsewhere." Before he could elaborate, young Diego Ortiz burst into the workshop, his apprentice's apron already smudged with glass dust despite the late hour. The boy's face was flushed with excitement. "Mr. Martinez! The whole town's talking about those riders at the Silver Spur Saloon. They've been asking questions about you, about your work. They say," Diego hesitated, glancing at Isabella, "they say you once made a lens so perfect it could focus sunlight to strike a target at 300 yards. That true?" Gabriel's response was cut off by the sound of more horses approaching, their hoofbeats carrying a different rhythm than before, more urgent, more purposeful. Sheriff Hawkins appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. "Got word from Santa Fe," she announced without preamble. "Cole and his gang hit the bank. They're last week, but that's not the worst of it." She lowered her voice, though only Isabella and Diego were present to hear. "They used special weapons, rifles fitted with crystal sights and precision lenses that let them pick off guards from impossible distances. The workmanship sounds familiar, Gabriel." Isabella watched as something shifted in Gabriel's demeanor. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and his grip on his glass-working tools tightened. "How many dead?" he asked quietly. "4, including a young teller who just happened to be in the wrong place. Witnesses say they'd never seen shooting like it before. Perfect accuracy even through the bank's warped window glass." Gabriel turned to his workbench, but Isabella could see the tension in his movements. "Those lenses," he said finally, "I made them 20 years ago for a special division of Pinkerton agents. After they were ambushed in Dodge City, their equipment vanished." He'd looked at Hawkins, "And now Cole has them. The question is," Hawkins pressed, "what's he planning to do with them here?" Before Gabriel could respond, Diego spoke up from where he'd been cleaning. "Mr. Martinez, what's this?" The boy was holding an old leather-bound journal he'd found. While organizing, its pages filled with intricate diagrams and mathematical formulas, Gabriel moved with surprising speed, taking the journal gently but firmly from Diego's hands. "Something that should have stayed buried," he muttered, but not before Isabella caught a glimpse of detailed sketches showing light paths through precisely ground crystal arrays. "Those men," she said slowly, understanding dawning, "they don't just want you to repair their weapons. They want you to make more." Gabriel's silence was answer enough. He carefully placed the journal in a hidden compartment beneath his workbench, his movements speaking of long practice at concealing things. "There was a time," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the hiss of his cooling furnace, "when I believed my craft could serve justice, that by creating perfect optical systems for law enforcement, I could help bring order to the frontier." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Learned the hard way that a weapon serves whoever holds it, and the line between justice and murder is thinner than a hair's width on a precision lens." Hawkins' hand rested on her gun, though the gesture seemed more habit than threat. "Those optical systems you made, Gabriel, I've heard stories. They say each one was different, crafted specifically. for its user. That you could watch a man shoot and know exactly what kind of sight would match his eye, his style. Stories, Gabriel grunted, but his eyes had taken on a distant look. Just stories now. Isabella stood, moving closer to the workbench where Gabriel had resumed shaping his mysterious glass spheres. Stories don't make men like Cole come looking, she said softly. And they don't put that look in your eyes when you talk about the past. The night had fully fallen now, the workshop, lit only by the furnace's glow and a few flickering lanterns. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of a storm. But inside, the air was thick with unspoken truths and the weight of decisions long past. "Miss Reyes," Gabriel said finally, his hands moving with precise control as he shaped another sphere. "There are some skills that once learned can never be unlearned, some knowledge that marks a man forever." He lifted the glass orb he was working on, examining it in the furnace light. "The trick isn't in forgetting what you know, it's in choosing each day how to use it." As if to punctuate his words, distant thunder rolled across the valley, a sound like artillery fire in the gathering dark. The storm was coming, in more ways than one, and Gabriel Martinez knew that soon he would have to decide whether the skills he'd spent 20 years trying to forget would be needed once again to protect the peace he'd found in Serpent's Pass. Dawn broke over the canyon walls, painting the red rock with stripes of gold and shadow. Gabriel had been at his workbench since before sunrise, but he wasn't crafting his usual windows or bottles. His weathered hands moved with focused precision as he examined one of Cole's men's rifles, his fingers tracing the intricate crystal sight that decorated its barrel. "I know this piece," he murmured to himself, holding the scope up to catch the morning light. It had been left behind in their hasty retreat the night before. The precision ground crystal caught the sun, revealing a pattern of geometric etchings he hadn't used in 2 decades. The door creaked open, and Gabriel quickly wrapped the rifle in a cloth. But it wasn't Cole or his men. It was old man Ramirez, the owner of the local cantina, his face ashen. "They're at my place, Gabriel," Ramirez said without preamble. "Cole and 8 others. They've been drinking since midnight, showing off those fancy rifles, but it's what they're saying that you need to hear." Gabriel set aside his tools, noting how the older man's hands trembled. "Tell me." "They're planning something big. A special train's coming through next week, carrying army payroll for 3 territories. They have inside information about the security, the route, everything, but they need something else." Ramirez paused, his dark eyes fixed on Gabriel. "They need special crystal sights, the kind only you know how to make." The significance of this hung in the air like furnace smoke. Gabriel's custom optical systems required equally custom crystal work, lenses and prisms he designed himself, crafted to maximize accuracy and light gathering without distortion. Without them, the rifles were just expensive firearms. "How do they know about that?" Gabriel's voice was dangerously quiet. "There's a man with them now, calls himself Thompson. Says he used to run with the Pinkerton agents back when I was supplying them," Gabriel finished. The name Thompson stirred something in his memory, a young face among the agents who'd come to his old shop, always hanging back, watching how he worked. Before Ramirez could respond, Isabella appeared in the doorway, her usual composed demeanor shaken. "Mr. Martinez, you need to see this." She led them to the schoolhouse where a crowd had gathered. On the building's freshly painted wall, someone had carved a message during the night. "Make the sights or we make examples." Sheriff Hawkins was already there, examining the crude letters. "This isn't just about robbing a train anymore," she said as Gabriel approached. "They're trying to force your hand." Gabriel touched the wall, his fingers tracing the deep cuts in the wood. "They're amateurs," he said quietly, "playing with things they don't understand." "What do you mean?" Isabella asked. "The optical systems they have, They're not just sights. Each one was crafted for a specific man, calibrated to his eye, his shooting style. Using them without understanding their nature, he shook his head. It's like giving a spyglass to a blind man. Hawkins' hand rested on her gun belt. Then maybe we should gather some men, stop them before— No, Gabriel cut her off. Regular rifles against those sights, even poorly used. They'd cut your men down before they got within 100 yards. He turned to Isabella. Get the children home. Keep them there. What are you going to do? She asked, but something in his expression made her pause. Gabriel was already walking back to his workshop, his mind racing through calculations he hadn't touched in years. The precise angles of crystal faces, the exact curvature of each lens, the intricate patterns that made his optical systems as distinctive as fingerprints. The first night of Gabriel's 3-day deadline brought no rest to his workshop. By starlight filtering through his own crafted windows, he and Diego worked at the specialized grinding station, its mechanisms casting otherworldly reflections across the walls. The strange patterns etched into its surface seemed to capture and redirect light in impossible ways. Pass me the selenite crystal, Gabriel instructed, his voice tight with concentration. Diego hurried to comply, handling the delicate mineral with reverent care. The young apprentice had never seen his master work like this. Every movement precise, every measurement exact, as if the slightest error could bring catastrophe. Isabella entered quietly, carrying a basket covered with a dark cloth. I found everything you asked for, she whispered, setting it down. Inside were rare crystals and minerals gathered from the deepest parts of the canyon, materials that seemed more suited to an alchemist's laboratory than a glassmaker's workshop. Good, Gabriel nodded, not looking up from his work. Now watch carefully, both of you. What I'm about to do isn't simple glassmaking, it's something older. He began combining the materials in specific proportions, adding them to a crucible, already glowing with molten crystal. The mixture sparked and swirled with unusual colors, deep purples and greens that had no place in normal glasswork. In the old days, Gabriel explained as he worked, craftsmen were more than just artisans. They were keepers of secrets, makers of things that straddled the line between craft and sorcery. His hands moved in practiced patterns over the crucible. Most of that knowledge was lost, but some of us found ways to rediscover it. A sharp knock at the door made them all jump. Sheriff Hawkins entered, her expression grim. Riders coming. Cole wants to check your progress. Isabella, Diego, out the back. Remember what I taught you about the next steps. As they slipped away, Cole strode in with Thompson and 2 others. The Outlaw's eyes went immediately to the strange grinding station and the glowing crucible. Making progress, I see, Cole observed, reaching for the crucible's cover. Touch that and you'll lose your sight, Gabriel said quietly. The crystal's at a delicate stage. Expose it to direct light now, and 3 days' work becomes 3 days wasted. Thompson stepped forward, studying the setup with knowing eyes. He's right, Marcus, I remember this part. The crystal has to be tempered in darkness, like developing a photographic plate. Cole snorted but withdrew his hand. Just make sure you're not playing us false, old man. We've got men watching every trail out of town. No one leaves without me saying so. Speaking of leaving, Thompson added, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. Tell me something, Master Martinez. That night at Ghost Ridge Pass, how did you do it? How did you make the Pinkerton agents' own sights turn against them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Gabriel continued working, his movements unhurried. You seem awfully interested in old stories, Thompson, almost like you're searching for something specific. Just trying to understand the craft, Thompson replied smoothly. After all, I might be the only one left alive who saw what those optical systems could really do, how they could bend light around corners, how they could focus starlight into killing beams, how they— Enough, Cole interrupted. We're not here for stories. Show us what you've done so far. Gabriel gestured to a row of crystal components cooling in their molds. First stage of the grinding has to happen naturally. Can't rush it. By morning, they'll be ready for the next phase. Which is? Precision cutting with very specific tools. Gabriel pointed to his old equipment. These aren't just lenses. Each one has to be cut to match its user's eye patterns, their shooting style. One mistake in the angles. He let the implication. Hank Thompson nodded slowly. I remember the process. The way the crystal would sing when you worked it, like glass about to shatter but never breaking. Something in his voice made Gabriel look at him sharply. The man knew too much. Remembered. Too much. And there was something else. Something in the way he kept touching the rifle at his hip, as if reassuring himself it was still there. After they left, Hawkins emerged from the shadows where she'd been listening. Thompson concerns me, the sheriff said quietly. He's not like the others. He understands what these optical systems really are. Yes, Gabriel agreed, uncovering the crucible. The crystal inside had turned a deep, impossible blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, which makes him the most dangerous one of all, because he knows just enough to be deadly, but not enough to be wise. The night deepened as Gabriel returned to his work. The process he'd begun wasn't just about unmaking optical systems. It was about unmaking the very principles that made them special. Each step had to be precise, each material added at exactly the right moment. Isabella returned with Diego, and Gabriel put them to work preparing the next phase. As they worked, he explained the true nature of what they were doing. An optical system made with these methods, he said, carefully measuring out a powder that seemed to bend light around itself, becomes more than just crystal and brass. It becomes a reflection of its maker's intent, bound by the rituals and materials used in its creation. Is that why they never miss? Diego asked, fascinated. They miss plenty, Gabriel corrected, but only when they're being used against their purpose. The sights I made for lawmen would never focus true for outlaws. The optical systems I crafted for protecting the innocent would become clouded in the hands of murderers. Then, how are Cole and his men using them at all? Isabella wondered. Because they stole them before their original owners died in battle. The optical systems never had a chance to fully reject them, but they're growing more unstable by the day. He smiled grimly. That's why they need me. The crystal is starting to fight back against being misused. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Shots rang out in the distance, followed by shouts and the thunder of hooves. Hawkins burst in, out of breath. Trouble at the south end of town. 2 of Cole's men got drunk, started shooting up the saloon. But that's not the worst part. She paused, catching her breath. A rider just came in from Fort Apache, the payroll train. It's not just carrying money. It's carrying something else, something they're calling classified military cargo. Gabriel's hands stilled on his tools. What kind of cargo? Don't know, but whatever it is, it's got the army sending a full company of cavalry to guard it. They'll be here the day after tomorrow. Same day the optical systems are supposed to be ready, Isabella realized. Not a coincidence, Gabriel said grimly. Cole isn't just planning to rob a train. He's after whatever that cargo is, and he needs working precision sights to do it. He turned to his grinding station, where the mysterious blue crystal still swirled with impossible colors. We need to work faster. Diego, realign the grinding wheels. Isabella, prepare the moonstone and quartz mixture. And Sarah, he looked at the sheriff, get word to those army troops. Tell them what they're riding into, but make sure Cole doesn't find out they've been warned. As they rushed to comply, Gabriel opened his old journal to a page he'd hoped never to use again. The instructions there weren't for making optical systems, but for unmaking them in the most complete way possible. It was dangerous knowledge, the kind that had nearly killed him at Ghost Ridge Pass. But as he began the complex process A noise at the window caught his attention. A shadow moved against the stars. Someone had been watching, listening. By the time Gabriel reached the window, the eavesdropper was gone, leaving only footprints in the dust. Small footprints like those of a man who'd spent years hanging back, watching, learning the secrets of a craft that was never meant to be shared. Thompson had just complicated everything. The question was, what would he do with what he'd overheard? The night grew deeper, and in Gabriel Martinez's workshop, the grinding wheels turned with sounds that nature never intended, as an old craftsman raced against time to undo the most dangerous things he'd ever created. The grinding station hummed with an unsettling resonance as Gabriel worked the crystal, each pass of the wheel drawing out colors that shouldn't exist. Thompson's spying had forced him to accelerate his plans, but some processes couldn't be rushed. One wrong angle, one misaligned facet, and the consequences would be catastrophic. "Mr. Martinez," Diego whispered, watching his master work with movements that seemed too precise to be entirely natural. "The crystal, it's changing color even when you're not touching it." Gabriel nodded grimly. "It remembers, boy. Crystal has a memory all its own. That's what makes it so dangerous in the wrong hands. That's why men like Thompson can never truly master it, no matter how many secrets they steal." Hawkins returned, her badge catching strange reflections from the working crystal. "Thompson's men are getting nervous. They've doubled the guards on every road out of town, and there's something else." She hesitated. "The rifles they're carrying, the ones with your optical systems. The men say they're starting to act. Strange. Sights fogging up for no reason, crystal components shifting in their mounts." "Good," Gabriel said softly. "That means they're remembering their true purpose." He held up a piece of worked crystal to the starlight. Within its depths, patterns moved like living things. These aren't just tools, they're judgments waiting to be passed. As the afternoon light filtered through the jail's high windows, Gabriel worked with increasing urgency. His fingers moved across the stone wall with practiced precision, tracing patterns that seemed to shimmer in the air before sinking into the rock. With each passing moment, the wall became more translucent, revealing shadowy shapes within its depths. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through the cell's small window, he could see Cole's men forcing their way into the parish hall, disrupting preparations for Isabella's play. The school teacher stood her ground in the doorway, every inch the protective guardian. "This is a community event," she declared loudly enough for her voice to carry to the jail. "If you want to search it, you'll need every family's permission." First, Gabriel smiled grimly. Isabella was playing her part perfectly, creating delays, forcing Cole's men to waste precious time navigating social protocols. But his satisfaction was short-lived as he spotted Thompson moving through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the jail's exterior wall, where the stone was gradually becoming transparent. Inside his cell, Gabriel worked faster. The outline of his master. Sight was becoming visible now, a piece of craftsmanship that made all his later works look crude by comparison. Its crystal array was inscribed with symbols that made his grinding wheel markings seem simple, each facet positioned to catch and redirect light in ways that defied conventional optics. "Martinez!" Sheriff Hawkins' boots sounded on the jail's wooden floor. "Thompson's asking questions about the jail's foundation. Says there's something wrong with the stone. Says it's singing to him." Gabriel cursed softly. "He's learned more than I thought. Get back outside, keep him occupied. I need 20 more minutes." But before Hawkins could respond, another voice joined their whispered conversation. Young Diego appeared at the cell window, the boy's face flushed with urgency. "Mr. Martinez," Diego hissed, "Sister Catherine isn't at the mission. She left a message, says she had to move it because someone was asking too many questions. She's taken it to where Deadliest sleeps." Gabriel's hands stilled on the wall. "The abandoned photography studio," he breathed. "Of course, where they used to store unexposed glass plates. Clever woman." He turned to Diego. "Did anyone follow you?" "No, but..." Diego hesitated. "There's something else. I overheard two of Cole's men talking about the military cargo on the train. They said it's not money or gold. They said it's some kind of new optical weapon, something that needs special crystal arrays to work." The implications hit Gabriel like a physical blow. "That's why they need my expertise. Not for the stolen sights, but for whatever's on that train." He pressed his hand flat against the wall, whispering words that made the stone pulse with inner light. "Diego, get to Isabella. Tell her to start the play early. We can't wait for sunset anymore." As Diego disappeared, Gabriel returned to his work with renewed urgency. The wall had become almost transparent now, revealing the full form of his masterwork. The sight wasn't just hidden in the stone. It had become part of it, its crystal and metal components combining with the living rock in ways that defied normal physics. Hawkins watched in fascination as Gabriel began the final stage of the extraction. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured. "No one has. Not for centuries," Gabriel replied, his voice strained with effort. The old craftsman understood that crystal and stone were just different states of the same essence. They could flow one into the other, merge and separate them. His fingers traced a final pattern, but the knowledge was lost, deemed too dangerous by those who couldn't understand it. The sight began to emerge from the wall like a sword being drawn from water, its surface rippling with colors that shouldn't exist in nature, deep violets and blues that seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly, the jail's front door burst open. Thompson stood there, his eyes wide with a hunger that had nothing to do with normal greed. "I knew it," he breathed, staring at the partially emerged sight. "I knew you hadn't just hidden it. You merged it with the earth itself." He drew his rifle, one of Gabriel's later works. "Step away from the wall, Master Martinez. That sight belongs to those who truly understand its power." Gabriel didn't move. "You understand nothing, Thompson. You've spent 20 years gathering pieces of knowledge, but you never learned the most important lesson." His hand closed around the grip of his master sight, still half embedded in the stone. "The craft isn't about power. It's about responsibility." Responsibility. Thompson laughed harshly. "Is that why you hid your greatest works? Why do you stop making optical systems that could have changed the territory forever?" "The world needs this knowledge, Martinez, needs what you can create." "The world isn't ready," Gabriel replied. "Men like you prove that. You think these sights are tools of power, but they're something else entirely. They're judgments, Thompson, each one a test of the soul that wields it." Outside, they could hear Isabella's students beginning their play, the sound of their singing providing a stark counterpoint to the tension in the jail cell. Thompson took a step forward, his stolen rifle aimed steadily at Gabriel's heart. "Step away from the wall, old man. Don't make me show you how well I've learned to use your creations." Gabriel's eyes met Thompson's without fear. "You still don't understand. These optical systems, these sights, they remember who made them. They remember what they were made for." His voice took on a rhythmic quality like a craftsman's blessing. "And they remember who betrayed their purpose." The rifle in Thompson's hands began to tremble. The stolen rifle shook violently, its crystal components beginning to glow with an unnatural light. Behind him, Sheriff Hawkins had drawn her own weapon, but Gabriel shook his head slightly. This wasn't a fight that could be won with ordinary bullets. "What's happening?" Thompson demanded, struggling to keep his grip on the trembling rifle. "What are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything," Gabriel replied calmly, his hand still resting on his master's sight in the wall. "The crystal is remembering the hands that crafted it, the purpose it was meant to serve." His voice took on a deeper resonance. "Remembering that you helped the Pinkerton agents corrupt its brothers, twist them from their true purpose." The crystal components in Thompson's rifle began to take on a reddish hue, as if they were heating in an invisible furnace. Smoke curled from the wooden stock, but he couldn't seem to let go. Impossible, Thompson gasped, his face contorted in pain. They're just glass and metal. That's where you went wrong, Gabriel said, beginning to draw his master sight further from the living rock. You stole the methods, the formulas, even the blessing words, but you never understood the heart of the craft. The wall around his weapon rippled like water. These sights aren't just tools, they're judges, created to serve justice itself. And now they're judging you. Outside, the children's play continued, their sweet voices singing about wandering stars and light that leads men astray. The irony wasn't lost on Gabriel as his master sight finally emerged fully from the stone wall, its surface rippling with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Deep violets and blues that seemed to move of their own accord. Thompson's stolen rifle was now glowing cherry red, its crystal components appearing to writhe like living things. Make it stop, he screamed, his hands smoking where they gripped the rifle. Gabriel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his master sight, a weight that went beyond mere physics. This weapon had been his first masterwork, created when he still believed that righteous violence could solve the world's ills. He'd learned better since then, learned that true justice rarely came from the barrel of a gun. But sometimes, to restore balance, one had to fight crystal with crystal that remembered its true purpose. Gabriel stepped out of the jail cell, his boot heels ringing on the wooden floor. Thompson lay still against the wall, the judgment of his stolen rifle marked in burns across his hands. He would recover eventually, and maybe, if he survived what was coming, he would finally understand the true meaning of the craft he'd tried to steal. Outside, the last light of day painted Serpent's Pass in colors that almost matched the otherworldly sheen of Gabriel's sight. Cole and his men waited in the street, their stolen optical systems drawn, not realizing that each sight was now a potential betrayer, each one remembering its true nature, awakening to the presence of the master sight that had come before them, all. Gabriel straightened his shoulders, feeling the years fall away. He wasn't just a glassmaker anymore, but he wasn't returning to being just a weapon maker either. He was something older, something that the ancient craftsmen had been before. Progress reduced their craft to mere optics. He was a maker of justice, a shaper of light, a keeper of knowledge that was never meant to be used lightly. And it was time to remind these men why the old ways had been hidden in the first place. Miguel, who had been quietly assisting with the grinding wheel, dropped his polishing cloth with a clatter, like your sights changing the crystal back there in the street. Similar principle, boy, but used for destruction instead of restoration. Gabriel's voice grew heavy with concern. Each shot through this military sight doesn't just strike its target, it changes what that target was, is, and could be. One blast could turn a cavalry charge into scattered sand, transform living men into pillars of salt, change an entire town into something that never existed at all. Isabella gasped softly. And that's what's on the train. That's what Cole and his men were really after? That's what Thompson was after, Gabriel corrected. Cole was just muscle to help move the sight, victims to test it on. Thompson wanted the weapon for himself, wanted to combine its power with what he'd stolen from my craft. He smiled grimly. That's why he was so interested in my work these past days. The military sight requires special crystal arrays to function, arrays made with methods similar to mine. Sister Catherine spoke up from where she sat in the corner, her gnarled hands working a rosary. But you've taken back the corrupted crystal. Surely that means... It means we have a chance, Gabriel interrupted. The crystal remembers its true purpose now, and with my master sight restored to full power. He lifted the weapon, its surface still rippling with impossible colors. We might be able to stop what's coming, but we'll need help. As if in answer to his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the night air. Hawkins moved to the window. Cavalry's here, she announced. Full company just like you asked for. Gabriel nodded in satisfaction. Good. They'll handle Cole's remaining men. But the real fight—" He turned back to his grinding wheel. "The real fight will be different. This military site, it's an abomination, a twisting of crafts that were meant to serve life, not unmake it. It has to be stopped before it reaches any populated area." "How?" Isabella asked. "If it can change the very nature of what it strikes." Gabriel pulled something from his grinding wheel, a crystal array, unlike any they'd ever seen. Its surface swirled with the combined essence of all his reclaimed sites, but there was something more. Symbols traced themselves across its facets, appearing and disappearing like living things. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "to unmake something truly evil, you have to be willing to unmake part of yourself as well." He held up the crystal. "This contains everything I know of the craft. Every secret, every blessing, every technique. When it strikes the military site, it won't just destroy it. It will erase the very knowledge that made it possible." "But that means—" Miguel's eyes widened with understanding. "Your craft, your special methods will be gone," Isabella finished. "Perhaps forever." Gabriel's voice held no regret. "As they should be. Some knowledge isn't meant to survive its time." Cavalry captain, a young man named Richards, entered the workshop. His eyes widened at the sight of the grinding wheel and its otherworldly light, but he maintained his composure. "Mr. Martinez," he said formally, "my men are positioned along the canyon rim. The train will be here within the hour. But, sir—" He hesitated. "We've received reports from our forward scouts. The men guarding the military site. They're not normal soldiers. They move wrong, like they're changed somehow." "The site's effects," Gabriel explained. "Even being near it warps things, changes them." He began loading his master site with the special crystal array. "Captain, your men need to focus on Cole's remaining gang. Leave the military site to me." "With all due respect, sir," Richards replied, "my orders are to secure that cargo at any cost." Gabriel fixed him with a steady gaze. "And what cost would that be, Captain? The lives of your men? The very existence of this town? Some prices are too high, even for following orders." Before Richards could respond, a distant whistle echoed through the canyon, the train approaching from the north. But the sound was wrong somehow, distorted in a way that made listeners' teeth ache. "It's beginning," Gabriel said grimly. "The site's influence is already reaching out, trying to change the nature of everything around it." He turned to Isabella. "Get everyone into the church. The thick walls might offer some protection from what's coming." "I'm not hiding," she declared firmly. "Not this time." Gabriel started to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He recognized that expression. He'd seen it in his own reflection years ago, when he'd first discovered the true power of his craft. "Very well," he conceded, "but stay behind me." "What's about to happen? It's not something that follows normal rules of nature." The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, and even more distorted. Through the workshop window, they could see strange lights playing across the canyon walls, colors that had no names in any human language. Gabriel checked his master sight one final time. The weapon hummed with power, the combined essence of all his reclaimed creations singing in its crystal. "Captain Richards," he said without taking his eyes off the approaching lights, "get your men ready, but give them this warning. If they see something that doesn't make sense, something that seems to defy reality itself, they need to fall back immediately. Don't try to fight it. Don't even look at it directly. Some things can change you just by being seen." The young captain nodded grimly and left to relay the orders. Outside, the cavalry troops took up their positions, their horses already stamping. Nervously at the wrongness in the air, Gabriel turned to Miguel. "Boy, stoke up the grinding wheel as hot as it will go. If something happens to me, if I fall—" He pressed a folded paper into the apprentice's hands. "These are the words of unmaking. Read them over the wheel. It won't be as complete as what I'm attempting, but it might be enough to prevent the worst." Miguel clutched the paper, his young face pale but determined. "Yes, sir, but you're coming back, aren't you?" The old glassmaker managed to smile. "Planning to. Still have plenty to teach you about honest glasswork. But if not," he glanced at Isabella, "take care of my workshop. Use it for good things, for creating, not destroying." The train's whistle screamed again, the sound now so distorted it barely resembled anything mechanical. The strange lights had reached the town's edge, and where they touched, reality seemed to blur and shift. Gabriel Martinez stepped out of his workshop, his master sight glowing with inner fire, ready to face a weapon that threatened not just lives, but the very fabric of existence itself. Behind him, Isabella and Sister Catherine began to pray, not just to God, but to whatever ancient powers had first taught men to shape crystal and imbue it with purpose. The night was about to become very strange indeed, the first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came when the moon's reflection in the water trough began to move in the opposite direction from the real moon above. Then the shadows of buildings began to stretch in impossible directions, some reaching upward instead of across the ground. "Sweet Mother of God," Captain Richards whispered, watching his own shadow split into 3 distinct shapes, each moving independently. Gabriel's master sight thrummed with increasing intensity as the train approached. The weapon seemed to be responding to whatever force was twisting reality around them, its crystal array rippling with patterns that spoke of order and purpose, standing firm against the chaos trying to unmake the world. "Mr. Martinez!" Isabella called from the workshop doorway. "The grinding wheel, it's changing color." Gabriel turned to see his grinding wheel burning with a light that seemed to consume darkness rather than illuminate it. The symbols etched into its surface were rearranging themselves, forming new patterns that spoke of ancient warnings and forgotten prophecies. "It's responding to the military site's presence," he explained. "The old craft recognizes its corrupted child." His voice hardened, "and rejects it." Thompson, still weak from his earlier judgment but now bound and guarded by Hawkins, laughed weakly. "You don't even know what that sight is capable of, do you? What does it really mean?" "And you do? It's not just a weapon." Thompson's burned. Hands trembled with excitement. "It's evolution, the next step in the craft you were too afraid to take." "Evolution?" Gabriel's voice cracked like a whip. "You think twisting the natural order is evolution? You think unmaking reality itself is progress?" He strode to where Thompson sat. "Let me show you what true mastery of the craft means." He pressed his hand against the wall of his workshop, and suddenly the wood grain began to shift and flow, revealing the true nature of the material beneath its everyday appearance. The dead wood momentarily returned to life, sap running through its grain, leaves trying to sprout from its surface. "That's mastery," Gabriel said quietly. "Not destroying what is, but revealing what could be, helping things become their truest selves." He released the wall, and the wood settled back to normal, though now it seemed somehow more real, more present than before. Thompson stared at the wall in shock. How did you—" "Because I learned the whole craft, not just the parts about power and destruction. I learned its heart, its purpose." Gabriel turned back to the approaching train, its whistle now sounding like the scream of reality tearing itself apart. "And that's why I have to stop what's coming, because it's not just wrong, it's an offense against creation itself." Isabella had been studying the crystal array Gabriel had forged earlier. "These symbols," she said suddenly, "they're not just decorative, are they? They're words." He checked his master sight again, studying how the crystal array caught and redirected, the strange lights now filling the street. "And when this array strikes that military site, those words will unmake not just the weapon, but the very knowledge that created it." "But, sir," Miguel spoke up, "if it unmakes that knowledge, what about all the good things that knowledge could do? The ways it could help people? Some prices have to be paid, boy, Gabriel replied grimly. Some doors need to stay closed. He placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder. Remember what I taught you about honest glasswork, about creating things that help rather than harm. That knowledge, the true heart of the craft that will survive. The rest, he shook his head. The rest should never have been rediscovered. The train's approach had turned the night into something from a fever dream. Reality rippled and buckled around them. Buildings momentarily became their own blueprints, then solid again. People's reflections in windows began to move independently, sometimes showing possible futures, sometimes showing paths not taken. Captain Richard's cavalry troops struggled to maintain their positions as their horses fought against rains that kept changing from leather to crystal and back again. The men's uniforms shifted between different eras, sometimes cavalry blue, sometimes Spanish colonial armor, sometimes designs that hadn't been invented yet. "Gabriel!" Sister Catherine called out urgently. "The church windows, they're moving!" They turned to see the stained glass windows Gabriel had crafted years ago, shifting in their frames, their images flowing like liquid color as they responded to the chaos around them. The blessed crystal from which they'd been made was reacting to the military site's influence, trying to maintain order in their own way. "Good," Gabriel said softly. "They remember their purpose too. They'll help anchor reality around the church. Keep our people safe." Hawkins, who had been positioning her deputies around the town, returned with troubling news. "Cole escaped in the confusion, and he's not the only one. Something's happening to the prisoners. They're changing." Gabriel's expression darkened. The site's influence. It's not just affecting physical reality, it's changing possibilities, showing people versions of themselves that could have been. He checked his ammunition one final time. And some men, when faced with other possibilities, choose the worst ones. The train was visible now, its form constantly shifting between different possible versions of itself. The steam engine became diesel and became something that ran on principles not yet discovered. And behind it all, reality itself seemed to be trying to escape, to run away from what was mounted on the last car. "My God," Richards breathed, using his binoculars. "The sight, it's not always there. Sometimes I see it. Sometimes I see through it to what might have been there instead." "Don't look at it directly," Gabriel warned. "Its nature is infectious. The more you try to understand it, the more it changes you to match its chaos." Isabella gripped Gabriel's arm suddenly. "The children in the church. I can hear them singing, but it's not just them. It's all possible versions of them, all singing different songs at once. Indeed, the hymn from the church seemed to layer upon itself, creating harmonies that spoke of paths not taken, choices not made, futures that might still be. The sound provided a strange counterpoint to the reality-warping approach of the train. Gabriel raised his master sight, its crystal array now glowing with a light that seemed to stabilize the air around it. The weapon had been created to serve truth, and now it faced its greatest test, bringing order not just to chaos, but to knowledge itself. "Remember," he told those around him, "whatever happens next, whatever you see, focus on what you know to be real, on who you really are. The military site doesn't just change physical reality, it changes memory, identity, possibility itself. Don't let it make you forget who you are." The train screamed into the station, its wheels somehow running on tracks that existed in multiple states at once. And mounted on the last car, surrounded by an aura of wrong geometry and impossible colors, stood the military site that should never have been made. Reality held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when ancient craft met corrupted science, when truth faced chaos, when the power to make met the power to unmake. Gabriel Martinez stepped forward, his master sight ready, about to wage a battle not just for lives or land, but for the very nature of what was real and what was possible. The train shuddered to a stop, steam hissing from its stack in patterns that wrote impossible equations in the air. The military sight mounted on the last car seemed to exist in multiple places at once, its barrel pointing in several directions simultaneously while its surface shifted between different materials that had never existed. Standing beside it were figures that had once been men, the military scientists who had created it. But their exposure to the weapon had changed them. They moved like marionettes, controlled by strings of probability, their faces constantly shifting between different possible versions of themselves. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Thompson called out, from where he was restrained. The perfect marriage of science and craft, the power to rewrite reality itself. Gabriel raised his master sight, its blessed crystal glowing with purpose. "There's nothing beautiful about corruption, Thompson, about twisting things from their true nature." The weapon hummed in his hands, recognizing the wrongness it faced. "This ends tonight." The lead scientist, or what remained of him, stepped forward. His voice echoed strangely, as if speaking from multiple timelines at once. "Mr. Martinez, we wondered if you'd come. Your reputation precedes you across several possibilities." "Then you know why I'm here." "To stop progress?" The scientist's face rippled, showing different ages, different choices. "This site represents the future, the ability to not just destroy our enemies, but to ensure they never existed in the first place." "That's not progress," Gabriel replied firmly. "That's perversion. You've taken sacred craft and twisted it into something that offends creation itself." As if in response to his words, reality buckled around them. The ground rippled like water, buildings briefly turned inside out, and the sky showed multiple versions of itself, day and night existing simultaneously. The battle for more than just Serpent's Pass was about to begin. The military site pulsed with sickly light, its crystal components shifting between states of existence. Where its influence touched the ground, reality became uncertain. Grass turned to sand, turned to glass, and back again. The air itself seemed to bend around it, showing glimpses of other possibilities, other worlds. "You don't understand what we've achieved here." The lead scientist's voice came from multiple mouths as his form flickered between possibilities. "This site doesn't just aim, it chooses. It selects which reality becomes true." "I understand perfectly," Gabriel replied, his master sight steady in his hands. "You've created something that violates the fundamental covenant between craftsman and creation. Your sight doesn't choose reality, it breaks it." Behind him, Isabella gasped as the ground beneath her feet briefly became transparent, showing layers of what might have been, foundations of buildings that were never built, bones of creatures that never existed, roots of trees that grew in other possibilities. "The Covenant?" Another scientist laughed, his voice echoing across timelines. "We've moved beyond such primitive concepts. This site represents pure possibility, unlimited by the arbitrary restrictions of what you call natural law." Gabriel's master sight hummed with increasing power, its crystal array glowing with colors that pushed back against the chaos. "Those laws aren't arbitrary. They're the framework that holds creation together. Break them and—" He was cut off by a sound like reality tearing. The military scientists had begun to rotate their sight's barrel, or rather, all possible versions of its barrel, toward the town. The air around it began to warp and twist, reality trying to escape what was about to happen. Gabriel didn't hesitate. His master sight spoke once, its report like a bell announcing judgment. The crystal array he'd crafted, carrying all his knowledge and power, streaked toward the military site, trailing light that somehow made the world more real around it. But one of the scientists touched their sight's housing, and suddenly the shot was traveling through a space where distance had become meaningless. "You don't understand," the lead scientist said, his voice echoing across possibilities. "We've moved beyond simple cause and effect. Your craft may be powerful, Mr. Martinez, but ours transcends craft itself. The military sight fired. The shot wasn't physical, it was conceptual, a burst of pure possibility that began unwriting the reality it touched. Where it struck the ground, matter became uncertain, cycling through different states of existence. But Gabriel was ready. His master sight fired again, not at the military site this time, but at the transformed Earth. Where his crystal struck, reality snapped back into focus, forced to remember what it truly was. "Miguel," he shouted, "the grinding wheel, now!" His apprentice understood, racing to the workshop's grinding wheel. Miguel began feeding it the materials Gabriel had prepared, crystals blessed with purpose, minerals that remembered their true nature. The wheel's light intensified, pushing back. Against the chaos the military site was creating, Sister Catherine began to pray, not in Latin or Spanish, but in words that sounded like crystal being ground, like light being shaped. The church windows spread their colors wider, their blessed glass helping to anchor reality around the building. The scientists fired their sight again and again, each shot creating a wave of possibility that threatened to unmake everything it touched. But Gabriel's master sight answered each time, its crystal array carrying the weight of true craft, of light, worked with purpose and blessing. "The wheel!" Isabella cried out. "It's reaching a critical temperature." Gabriel nodded grimly. This was what he'd planned for. "Captain Richards, get your men clear. What's about to happen? It won't follow any rules of warfare, you know." The grinding wheel had begun to pulse with a light that made the military site's reality-warping effects seem pale in comparison. The crystal within it had reached a state that transcended normal physics, becoming something that existed not just in reality, but in the space where reality was forged. Thompson, watching from his restraints, began to laugh hysterically. "You, can't. You'll destroy everything we've learned, all the power we've gained." "Some power isn't meant for men to have," Gabriel replied. He turned to Isabella. "Get everyone into the church. The windows will protect you." "And Isabella?" He met her eyes. "If this works, I won't be the same. The knowledge, the craft, it'll all be gone." She gripped his hand fiercely. "Then we'll start over. Build something new, something better." Gabriel smiled, then turned back to face the military site. Its barrel was spinning through multiple dimensions now, preparing to fire a shot that would unwrite not just the town, but the very possibility of its existence. "Miguel," he called out, "the words I taught you, speak them now." As Miguel began to recite the ancient craftsman's blessings, Gabriel raised his master sight one final time. But instead of aiming at the military site, he aimed at his own. Grinding wheel. The scientists realized too late what he was attempting. "No, you'll create a resonance cascade. Reality itself will..." Gabriel pulled the trigger. The crystal array struck the grinding wheel just as it reached transcendent heat. There was a sound, like every bell in creation ringing at once, like the first crystal ever shaped, like the voice of light remembering what it was meant to be. The grinding wheel exploded, not with force or shrapnel, but with pure truth. A wave of reality-affirming power met the military site's chaos head-on. When they clashed, possibility itself seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, every version of reality was visible at once. They saw the town as it was, as it had been, as it might have been. They saw themselves in all their possible forms. They saw truth and lies, creation and destruction, all balanced on a knife's edge of probability. Then Gabriel's grinding wheel. Light one. The wave of truth swept over everything, forcing reality to remember itself. The military site screamed as it was unmade, not just destroyed, but erased from possibility itself. The scientists' multiple forms collapsed into single, human shapes, men who would have to live with what they'd attempted. But the cost was high. As the light faded, Gabriel felt the knowledge leaving him, not just the formulas and techniques, but the deep understanding that had made him a master of his craft. The sacred words became just words. The blessing patterns, just decorative marks. The price of unmaking chaos was the loss of his own power. Yet as he watched his grinding wheel cool into ordinary crystal, as his master sight became just a finely crafted tool, Gabriel Martinez felt not loss, but relief. Some knowledge was too heavy to carry, some power too great to wield. Captain Richards approached cautiously, staring at the place where the military site had been. There was nothing left, not even a memory of its shape in the air. "What happened?" the young officer asked. "What did you do?" "Reminded the world what it really is," Gabriel replied, holstering his now ordinary sight. "Sometimes that's enough." He turned to Miguel, who was watching the grinding wheel's light fade. "Come on, boy. Time to learn honest glasswork. The kind that builds things up instead of tearing them down." As dawn began to paint the canyon walls, the town of Serpent's Pass found itself firmly rooted in a single, solid reality. The church. Windows settled back to simple stained glass, their colors folding around memories that would soon fade like morning mist. The aftermath of the confrontation brought its own challenges. As reality settled back into its proper shape, the consequences of what had occurred began to ripple through Serpent's Pass. The military scientists, now fully human again, sat in Sheriff Hawkins' jail, their faces haunted by the memory of what they'd almost unleashed. "You don't understand what you've done," one of them told Gabriel through the cell bars, his voice shaking. "That knowledge, that power, it could have revolutionized everything, changed the course of human history." "Some revolutions come at too high a price," Gabriel replied, noting how his hands no longer tingled when he touched the crystal. "Some changes aren't worth the cost." Isabella found him later in his workshop, sifting through the remains of his grinding wheel. The mysterious symbols had faded from its surface, leaving only ordinary crystals behind. The specialized tools he'd used now looked like any other glassmaker's implements. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up all that knowledge?" Gabriel ran his fingers over the wheel's now mundane surface. "Knowledge isn't lost, Isabella. It's just waiting to be rediscovered when the time is right, when people are ready for it." He picked up a simple glass cutter. "Besides, there's wisdom in ordinary things too, in honest work and clean crystal." Miguel appeared in the doorway, carrying newly made window panes, his first solo project since the events of the night before. "Mr. Martinez, these came out wrong, didn't they?" He held up the glass, which was slightly uneven, but showed promise. Gabriel examined them with new eyes. Not the eyes of a master of mystical craft, but those of a skilled tradesman. "No, boy, they came out exactly as they should have. Made by human hands with human skill. That's a different kind of magic altogether." Sister Catherine visited later that day, bringing news from the church. "The windows have stopped moving," she reported. "They're just glass now, beautiful glass, but—" She touched the cross at her neck. "The blessing in them has gone quiet." "As it should," Gabriel nodded. "The time for such things has passed, at least for now." He gestured to the cooling window panes. "But look there. See how the glass takes its shape, how it becomes what it needs to be, not through supernatural power, but through skill and patience. There's beauty in that too." Captain Richards had remained in town with a small detachment, overseeing the removal of what little physical evidence remained of the reality-warping site. He found Gabriel at his workbench that evening. "My superiors won't believe the official report," he said without preamble, "about what really happened here." "Probably for the best," Gabriel replied, working on a simple drinking glass. "Some things are better left to legend and rumor." "But the scientists—" Richards hesitated. "They remember everything. Multiple versions of everything. They remember." "Possibilities, Captain. But possibilities aren't the same as realities. In time, those memories will fade, become like dreams, things that might have been but never were. Thompson, still in custody but recovering from his burns, had become strangely peaceful. When Gabriel visited him, the former apprentice was tracing patterns in the dust of his cell floor, but ordinary patterns now, without power or purpose. "I understand now," Thompson said quietly, "what you tried to teach me all those years ago, about the difference between knowing how to do something and knowing whether you should." He looked up at his former master. "The craft. It wasn't about power at all, was it?" "No," Gabriel agreed. "It was about responsibility. About understanding that just because you can shape reality doesn't mean you should." He studied with his former student. "Maybe now you're ready to learn the real craft, the everyday magic of making things that help rather than harm." As evening approached, Gabriel stood in his workshop doorway, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls. The light was just light now, not multiple possibilities of illumination. The shadows were simply shadows, not doorways to what might have been. Isabella joined him, her hand finding his. "The children want to know if you'll still make marbles for them, even without the special crystal." Gabriel smiled, feeling the weight of ordinary tools at his belt. Tools that could still create wonders, just slower, simpler ones. "Reckon I will. Might not be able to make glass that catches starlight anymore, or prisms that show tomorrow's weather." He patted his glass cutter. "But sometimes the best gifts are the ones made with nothing but skill and care. And love," Isabella added softly. "And love," he agreed. "The most ordinary magic of all, and maybe the most powerful." Inside his workshop, the grinding wheel turned with natural motion, ready for another day of honest work. The master sight, now just a finely crafted tool, hung on the wall, a reminder of what had been and what had been given up. But as Gabriel Martinez prepared for a simpler life of working crystal with mundane skill rather than supernatural craft, he felt no regret. For in choosing to unmake the power that could have reshaped reality, he had preserved something far more precious: the right of every soul to forge its own destiny, one choice at a time. A month passed, and autumn painted Serpent's Pass in shades of gold and crimson. The events of that strange night had begun to fade from most people's memories, becoming more like a shared dream than reality. But subtle changes remained visible to those who knew where to look. The military scientists had been quietly transferred to a facility back east, their ramblings about multiple realities and possibility-warping sites dismissed as trauma-induced delusions, all except one, the youngest of them, Dr. James Wilson, who had asked to stay in Serpent's Pass. "I need to understand," he told Gabriel one morning, watching the Glassmaker work ordinary crystal with extraordinary skill. "Not the power we lost, but the wisdom we never had." Gabriel studied the young scientist as he shaped a simple lens with practiced strokes. "Wisdom usually starts with simple things," he replied, holding up the glowing glass. "Like understanding that true strength isn't in how much you can change something, but in knowing when to let it be what it is." Wilson had taken to spending his mornings at the workshop, not trying to relearn the lost supernatural craft, but studying the everyday magic of skillful glasswork. His scientific mind found new fascination in the ordinary physics of optics, in the way different crystals behaved under heat and pressure. Isabella's school had changed too. The children who had been present during the reality-warping incident retained a certain sensitivity to possibility. They saw patterns others missed, understood connections that weren't obvious. She had adapted her teaching to help them channel this awareness into creativity rather than chaos. "They're different now," she told Gabriel during one of their evening conversations. "Not in any way you could measure or prove, but—" She gestured to where her students were performing a new play, one they had written themselves about a town where magic hid in ordinary things. "They understand something most adults forget," Gabriel nodded. that wonder doesn't need supernatural power to exist. It's in the way glass flows, in how stories shape themselves, in the patterns that connect all things. Winter came early to Serpent's Pass, bringing with it winds that seemed to whisper secrets in the language of frost and crystal. Drake's activities had not gone unnoticed. His company had purchased 5 old glassworks in neighboring towns, each one historically connected to craftsmen who had worked with more than mere glass. One cold morning, Dr. Wilson burst into Gabriel's workshop, his scientific composure shattered by excitement. "You need to see this," he declared, spreading out several telegrams on the workbench. "Reports from Drake's facilities. They're doing something unprecedented." Gabriel studied the messages while Isabella and Miguel gathered around. The reports described strange occurrences at Drake's newly acquired glassworks. Crystal behaving in ways that defied conventional physics, lenses operating at impossible clarities, workers developing an almost supernatural affinity for their materials. "He's trying to industrialize it," Gabriel realized grimly, "taking the natural patterns we've observed and attempting to force them into production." He picked up one of the telegrams. "Mass-producing miraculous glass, as if nature's own voice could be captured in an assembly line." "But that's not the worst part," Wilson continued, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "Look at what they're making." The article detailed Drake Industries' new line of enhanced products. Lenses that never seemed to blur, mirrors that could see through darkness, glass that could heal its own cracks, all explained away with vague references to revolutionary optical processes and advanced scientific principles. "He's walking a dangerous line," Gabriel muttered, "not twisting reality like the military site did, but still trying to force nature's hand. And nature—" He gestured to his own grinding wheel, where honest work waited. "Nature has a way of pushing back against such presumption." As if to emphasize his point, a strange sound began emanating from Drake's spectacles, which Gabriel had kept for study. The lenses had developed new patterns, but now they seemed agitated, distressed, the crystal designs writhing like snakes trying to escape their frames. Isabella's students had noticed changes too. Their drawings had become increasingly complex, filled with patterns that seemed to predict events before they happened. One child had sketched what looked like a factory consumed by living glass, the lines of the drawing rippling on the page like waves in a pond. "There's more," Hawkins announced, entering the workshop with fresh telegrams. "Drake's workers, some of them are changing, not like the reality warping from before, but—" She struggled to find the right words. "It's like the glass is teaching them things they weren't ready to learn. Like what happened to me when I stole knowledge I wasn't prepared for." Thompson spoke up from where he'd been quietly working on a church window. "But this is different. It's not chaos trying to break free, it's—" He held up his hands, still bearing the scars of his judgment. "It's an order trying to maintain itself," Gabriel nodded slowly. "The old craft wasn't just about power. It was about responsibility, about understanding your place in the natural order of things. Try to force that order, try to bend it to human greed." He let the thought hang ominously. Dr. Wilson's scientific mind was racing with possibilities. But surely if we could study it, understand the principles at work, that's exactly the kind of thinking that created the military site. Gabriel interrupted firmly. "Some things aren't meant to be studied and replicated. They're meant to be experienced, understood, respected." Sister Catherine entered carrying news from her contacts in other parishes. "The effects are spreading," she reported. "Every glassworks Drake buys, every factory he converts, they become nexus points for these changes. The crystal remembers more strongly there, speaks more loudly. And not always kindly," Thompson added. "I've heard stories of machines turning on their operators, of molten glass flowing against gravity, of factories where the laws of nature simply stop working." Gabriel picked up his glass cutter, a simple tool that had never been enhanced by supernatural craft. but had shaped crystal, true for decades, because Drake and his kind don't understand. They see the patterns emerging in the glass, the way it remembers its true nature, and they think it's just another resource to be exploited. But it's fighting back. Not with chaos like before, Miguel said suddenly, understanding dawning in his young face, but with truth, showing us what happens when you try to cage nature's voice in machines. A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Drake's men had arrived, not a businessman this time, but a worker from his nearest facility. The man's clothes were stained, with crystalline residue that seemed to move of its own accord, and his eyes held a haunted look. "Mr. Martinez," he gasped, clutching the workshop's doorframe. "You have to help us. The glass, it's awakening, not like you said it would, not natural and slow, but—" He held out his hands, which had developed a glassy sheen. Drake pushed too hard, tried to force it, and now Gabriel examined the man's hands carefully. The crystal wasn't corrupting him like the military site had corrupted its creators. Instead, it seemed to be teaching him, but too fast, too forcefully, like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. "How many others?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Dozens, and more every day. The machines, they're changing too. Not just working better than they should, but—" The workers shuddered. "They're starting to work together, with purpose, like they're building something we don't understand." Dr. Wilson was frantically taking notes, but Isabella noticed something odd about his paper. The ink was arranging itself into familiar patterns, the same ones they'd been seeing in the glass. The natural world was speaking through every medium it could find, trying to warn them. "We have to stop him," Hawkins declared. "Drake's factories are already stopping themselves," Gabriel interrupted, holding up Drake's spectacles. Their crystal had aligned into a pattern that pointed directly at the largest nearby facility. "The question is whether they'll stop cleanly or take half the territory with them when nature finally loses patience." Sister Catherine clutched her rosary, which had begun developing the same swirling pattern seen in the glass. "What can we do?" Gabriel turned to his grinding wheel, his simple, honest wheel that had never tried to be more than it was. "We remind the glass of its true nature, not with supernatural craft or industrial greed, but with understanding, with respect." He began heating crystals, his movements precise and reverent. "We show that some of us still remember the right way to work with nature's voice." The winter wind howled outside, carrying the sound of distant factories where glass was awakening to its own power, its own purpose. And in his workshop, Gabriel Martinez prepared to teach one final lesson about the difference between mastering nature and working in harmony with it. Miguel's training had taken an interesting turn. Without access to supernatural craft, he had developed an almost uncanny intuition for crystal's natural properties. His work showed a precision that went beyond mere technical skill, a deep understanding of how materials wanted to behave. "The glass still speaks," he explained to Dr. Wilson one day, working on a complex lens. "Not with magic anymore, but with its own voice. You just have to learn to listen differently." Sheriff Hawkins had her own adjustments to make. The jail cells that had briefly held reality-warped prisoners now housed ordinary criminals. But something about the space had changed. Inmates reported strange dreams, moments of startling clarity about their lives and choices. "It's like the walls remember," Hawkins told Gabriel. "Not the chaos from that night, but the return to order makes people think about their own need to set things right." Thompson, recovered from his burns and no longer a prisoner, had begun helping Sister Catherine restore the church's stained glass. His hands, once burned by corrupted power, now found healing in crafting simple but beautiful things. Window, frames, altar pieces, lanterns for evening services. Each piece is a kind of penance, he explained to Gabriel when his former master came to inspect the work. Not trying to grasp power anymore, just trying to add some beauty to the world, to make up for what I almost helped destroy. But not all changes were peaceful. Word had spread about Serpent Pass's Glassmaker, distorted tales of the confrontation with the reality-warping site. Other craftsmen began arriving, drawn by rumors of lost knowledge and hidden power. One morning, Gabriel found a man waiting at his workshop, a wealthy industrialist named Victor Drake, who had made his fortune manufacturing optical instruments back east. "I know what happened here," Drake declared without preamble. "Not the sanitized military report or the local legends. I know about the craft, Mr. Martinez, and I believe some fragments of that knowledge must remain." Gabriel continued his work, carefully polishing a simple lens. "Believe what you want, Mr. Drake. Knowledge that's meant to survive, survives in its own way, in its own time." "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer," Drake pressed, "for any remnants of your special techniques. Even incomplete knowledge would be invaluable." Gabriel led Drake to the back of his shop, where rows of finished pieces stood on display. Window panes, drinking glasses, simple prisms, and children's marbles. "See these?" Gabriel gestured to the items, made with skill, patience, and understanding of the crystal's nature. No supernatural craft, no reality-warping power, just honest work that helps people live better lives. He picked up a small glass bird he'd made for one of Isabella's students. "Tell me, Mr. Drake, which is more valuable, power that can unmake reality, or skill that can bring joy to a child?" Drake scoffed. "Noble sentiments, Mr. Martinez, but we both know there's more to it. The military scientists, their minds, were affected by exposure to possibilities that shouldn't exist. Surely some echo of that knowledge remains." "Only as a reminder," Gabriel interrupted firmly. "Why do some doors remain closed?" He returned to his grinding wheel. "Now, if you're interested in learning actual glasswork, I'm always willing to teach. But if you're hunting for power that's better left forgotten, you're wasting both our time." Yet even as he dismissed Drake, Gabriel noticed something interesting. The industrialist's pocket watch crystal, a seemingly ordinary piece of glasswork, had begun to develop an unusual pattern. The crystal surface showed shapes that looked almost like the blessing symbols that had once adorned his special grinding wheel. "Strange," Gabriel mused after Drake had left. "Maybe some knowledge does survive, but not in ways we expect. Not in ways that can be bought or sold or used for power." He touched his glass cutter thoughtfully. "Maybe it survives in the crystal itself, waiting for the right time, the right hands, the right purpose." That evening, as Gabriel taught Miguel the intricacies of tempering glass, he reflected on how the craft had changed without really ending. The supernatural power was gone, but the deeper magic, the everyday miracle of taking raw crystal and shaping it into something useful and beautiful, remained as strong as ever. And perhaps that had been the true lesson all along. Not that power must be destroyed to prevent its misuse, but that the greatest powers often hide in the simplest things. In skilled hands shaping honest materials, in wisdom passed from master to apprentice, in the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The sun set over Serpent's Pass, painting the workshop in shades of gold and shadow. Isabella's children could be heard in the distance, singing songs about possibilities and choices. Sister Catherine's restored church windows caught the light in ways that seemed to make the air itself more real. And Gabriel Martinez, no longer a master of supernatural craft, but still a master of his trade, prepared to teach his apprentice the most important lesson of all, that true magic isn't in bending reality to your will, but in helping reality become more fully what it already is. The following days brought more visitors like Drake, men of wealth and ambition who'd caught wind of the strange tales spreading from Serpent's Pass. Each came with offers more generous than the last, each left disappointed but oddly changed by their encounters with the humble glassmaker. Dr. Wilson noticed it first. Their eyeglasses, he said one evening, watching another frustrated industrialist leave the shop. Every time they come here, their lenses start behaving strangely, not cracking or warping, but he struggled to find the right words. It's like they're becoming more real, Isabella suggested, having observed the same phenomenon. More true to what glass should be. Gabriel examined a pair of spectacles that a particularly insistent visitor had left behind as a bribe. The crystal lenses had begun developing patterns that shouldn't have been possible, subtle spirals and curves that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "The crystal remembers," he said quietly. "Not the power we unmade, but something old, something that was there all along, before we learned to twist it with supernatural craft." He handed the spectacles to Miguel. "What do you feel?" The apprentice held them carefully, his fingers tracing the emerging patterns. "It's like they're trying to tell a story, not with words or pictures, but with their own nature." His eyes widened. "Is this what you meant about a crystal having its own voice?" Partly, Gabriel nodded. "But there's more. Dr. Wilson, what does your scientific mind make of these patterns?" The young scientist adjusted his own spectacles, studying the lenses closely. "They're not random. There's a mathematical precision to them, but it's not any geometry I've studied." He pulled out a notebook, sketching rapidly. "Look here. The curves follow the same ratios we see in natural growth patterns, shell spirals, leaf arrangements, the way crystals form naturally. The language of creation itself," Sister Catherine said from the doorway. She'd come to discuss the church's new rose window, but found herself drawn into the conversation. "Not the words of power you used to use, Mr. Martinez, but the grammar that underlies all things." Isabella, who had been grading papers at her usual corner of the workshop, looked up thoughtfully. "Is that why my students' drawings have changed? They're not just pictures anymore. They're full of patterns that seem to mean something, even if we can't quite read them." Gabriel picked up his glass cutter, studying its worn handle. "When we unmade the reality-warping power, we didn't destroy the underlying truth it had twisted. We just let it return to its natural state." He smiled at Miguel's confused expression. "Like a working crystal, you can force it into shapes that defy nature, or you can help it become what it was always meant to be." Thompson, who had taken to visiting in the evenings to discuss his work at the church, added his own observation. "The windows we've been crafting, people say they feel different when they catch the light. Not supernatural, just real. More real than ordinary glass." "Because you're working with the crystal's nature now, not against it," Gabriel explained, "understanding it instead of trying to dominate it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Hawkins, looking troubled. "Got word from the territorial marshal. Drake isn't just a wealthy industrialist. He's been buying up every old glassworks he can find, especially ones with unusual histories. Looking for traces of the old craft, but finding something else instead," Gabriel mused. He described the strange behavior of the visitors' eyeglasses and spectacles. Hawkins nodded grimly. "That's not all. The marshal says wherever Drake sets up his operations, strange things start happening. Not reality-warping chaos like before, but changes. Glass objects developing unusual patterns, lenses that work better than they should, mirrors that seem to show more than just reflections." Dr. Wilson leaned forward eagerly. "A natural phenomenon emerging to fill the void left by the supernatural. Graft, fascinating, we could study it, document it, or," Gabriel interrupted firmly, "we could let it be what it is. Some things need to grow in their own time, their own way." He turned to Hawkins. "Still, keep an eye on Drake. Men like him have a way of trying to force nature's hand." The sheriff departed, leaving them to ponder this new development. Isabella's students could be heard in the schoolyard, their games now incorporating complex patterns that seemed to mirror the ones appearing in glass across the town. "Mr. Martinez," Miguel asked suddenly, If the supernatural craft is gone, but the crystal still remembers, what are we really learning here? Gabriel picked up a piece of raw glass, holding it so his apprentice could see how the light played across its surface. We're learning to listen, boy. Not to words of power or blessing patterns, but to the crystal itself. To understand what it wants to become, not what we want to force it to be. Like the way you knew that church window needed more sand in the mix, Dr. Wilson interjected. Not from any formula or supernatural insight, but from... He waved his hands, searching for the right words. From paying attention, Gabriel finished. From respecting the materials and the craft enough to let them teach you their nature. He began heating glass in his furnace. His ordinary furnace now, but somehow no less magical for its simplicity. As the material began to glow, they all saw it. Patterns in the heat, in the way the glass took the fire, in how it responded to Gabriel's skilled hands. Not supernatural manifestations, but the subtle language of the craft itself speaking. To those who had learned to listen, Sister Catherine crossed herself, but her expression was one of wonder rather than fear. Perhaps this is how it was always meant to be. Not power that breaks the world's laws, but wisdom that helps us understand them better. The evening deepened around them, and in Gabriel Martinez's workshop, a new kind of craft was taking shape, one built not on supernatural power, but on the deeper magic of skill, understanding and respect for the true nature of things. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Drake's spectacles kept time with rhythms older than human reckoning, their crystal remembering truths that no amount of ambition or wealth could ever truly possess. Sister Catherine entered, carrying news from her contacts in other parishes. "The effects are spreading," she reported. "Every glassworks Drake buys, every factory he converts, they become nexus points for these changes. The crystal remembers more strongly there, speaks more loudly. And not always kindly," Thompson added. "I've heard stories of machines turning on their operators, of molten glass flowing against gravity, of factories where the laws of nature simply stop working." Gabriel picked up his glass cutter, a simple tool that had never been enhanced by supernatural craft, but had shaped crystal true for decades. Because Drake and his kind don't understand, they see the patterns emerging in the glass, the way it remembers its true nature, and they think it's just another resource to be exploited. But it's fighting back. "Not with chaos like before," Miguel said suddenly, understanding dawning in his young face, "but with truth, showing us what happens when you try to cage nature's voice in machines." A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Drake's men had arrived, not a businessman this time, but a worker from his nearest facility. The man's clothes were stained, with crystalline residue that seemed to move of its own accord, and his eyes held a haunted look. "Mr. Martinez," he gasped, clutching the workshop's doorframe, "you have to help us. The glass, it's awakening. Not like you said it would, not natural and slow, but..." He held out his hands, which had developed a glassy sheen. Drake pushed too hard, tried to force it, and now... Gabriel examined the man's hands carefully. The crystal wasn't corrupting him like the military site had corrupted its creators. Instead, it seemed to be teaching him, but too fast, too forcefully, like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. "How many others?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Dozens, and more every day. The machines, they're changing too. Not just working better than they should, but..." The worker shuddered. "They're starting to work together with purpose, like they're building something we don't understand." Dr. Wilson was frantically taking notes, but Isabella noticed something odd about his paper. The ink was arranging itself into familiar patterns, the same ones they'd been seeing in the glass. The natural world was speaking through every medium it could find, trying to warn them. "We have to stop him," Hawkins declared. "Drake's factories are already stopping themselves," Gabriel interrupted, holding up Drake's spectacles. Their crystal had aligned into a pattern that pointed directly at the largest nearby facility. The question is whether they'll stop cleanly or take half the territory with them when nature finally loses patience. Sister Catherine clutched her rosary, which had begun developing the same swirling pattern seen in the glass. What can we do? Gabriel turned to his grinding wheel, his simple, honest wheel that had never tried to be more than it was. We remind the glass of its true nature, not with supernatural craft or industrial greed, but with understanding, with respect. He began heating crystals, his movements precise and reverent. We show that some of us still remember the right way to work with nature's voice. The winter wind howled outside, carrying the sound of distant factories where glass was awakening to its own power, its own purpose. And in his workshop, Gabriel Martinez prepared to teach one final lesson about the difference between mastering nature and working in harmony with it. Miguel's training had taken an interesting turn. Without access to supernatural craft, he had developed an almost uncanny intuition for crystals' natural properties. His work showed a precision that went beyond mere technical skill, a deep understanding of how materials wanted to behave. "The glass still speaks," he explained to Dr. Wilson one day, working on a complex lens. "Not with magic anymore, but with its own voice. You just have to learn to listen differently." Sheriff Hawkins had her own adjustments to make. The jail cells that had briefly held reality-warped prisoners now housed ordinary criminals, but something about the space had changed. Inmates reported strange dreams, moments of startling clarity about their lives and choices. "It's like the walls remember," Hawkins told Gabriel. "Not the chaos from that night, but the return to order makes people think about their own need to set things right." Thompson, recovered from his burns and no longer a prisoner, had begun helping Sister Catherine restore the church's stained glass. His hands, once burned by corrupted power, now found healing in crafting simple but beautiful things. Window frames, altar pieces, lanterns for evening services. Each piece is a kind of penance, he explained to Gabriel when his former master came to inspect the work. Not trying to grasp power anymore, just trying to add some beauty to the world. To make up for what I almost helped destroy, but not all changes were peaceful. Word had spread about Serpent Pass's Glassmaker, distorted tales of the confrontation with the reality-warping site. Other craftsmen began arriving, drawn by rumors of lost knowledge and hidden power. One morning, Gabriel found a man waiting at his workshop, a wealthy industrialist named Victor Drake, who had made his fortune manufacturing optical instruments back east. "I know what happened here," Drake declared without preamble. "Not the sanitized military report or the local legends. I know about the craft, Mr. Martinez, and I believe some fragments of that knowledge must remain." Gabriel continued his work, carefully polishing a simple lens. "Believe what you want, Mr. Drake. Knowledge that's meant to survive survives in its own way, in its own time." "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer," Drake pressed, "for any remnants of your special techniques. Even incomplete knowledge would be invaluable." Gabriel led Drake to the back of his shop, where rows of finished pieces stood on display. Window panes, drinking glasses, simple prisms, and children's marbles. "See these?" Gabriel gestured to the items. "Made with skill, patience, and understanding of the crystal's nature. No supernatural craft, no reality-warping power, just honest work that helps people live better lives." He picked up a small glass bird he'd made for one of Isabella's students. "Tell me, Mr. Drake, which is more valuable? This power that can unmake reality or skill that can bring joy to a child?" Drake scoffed. "Noble sentiments, Mr. Martinez, but we both know there's more to it. The military scientists, their minds were affected by exposure to possibilities that shouldn't exist. Surely some echo of that knowledge remains." Only as a reminder, Gabriel interrupted firmly. Why do some doors remain closed? He returned to his grinding wheel. Now, if you're interested in learning actual glasswork, I'm always willing to teach. But if you're hunting for power that's better left forgotten, you're wasting both our time. Yet even as he dismissed Drake, Gabriel noticed something interesting. The industrialist's pocket watch crystal, a seemingly ordinary piece of glasswork, had begun to develop an unusual pattern. The crystal's surface showed shapes that looked almost like the blessing symbols that had once adorned his special grinding wheel. Strange, Gabriel mused after Drake had left. Maybe some knowledge does survive, but not in ways we expect. Not in ways that can be bought or sold or used for power. He touched his glass cutter thoughtfully. Maybe it survives in the crystal itself, waiting for the right time, the right hands, the right purpose. That evening, as Gabriel taught Miguel the intricacies of tempering glass, he reflected on how the craft had changed without really ending. The supernatural power was gone, but the deeper magic, the everyday miracle of taking raw crystal and shaping it into something useful and beautiful, remained as strong as ever, and perhaps that had been the true lesson all along. Not that power must be destroyed to prevent its misuse, but that the greatest powers often hide in the simplest things, in skilled hands shaping honest materials, in wisdom passed from master to apprentice, in the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The sun set over Serpent's Pass, painting the workshop in shades of gold and shadow. Isabella's children could be heard in the distance, singing songs about possibilities and choices. Sister Catherine's restored church windows caught the light in ways that seemed to make the air itself more real. And Gabriel Martinez, no longer a master of supernatural craft, but still a master of his trade, prepared to teach his apprentice the most important lesson of all. That true magic isn't in bending reality to your will, but in helping reality become more fully what it already is. The following days brought more visitors like Drake, men of wealth and ambition who'd caught wind of the strange tales spreading from Serpent's Pass. Each came with offers more generous than the last, each left disappointed but oddly changed by their encounters with the humble glassmaker. Dr. Wilson noticed it first. "They're eyeglasses," he said one evening, watching another frustrated industrialist leave the shop. "Every time they come here, their lenses start behaving strangely, not cracking or warping, but—" He struggled to find the right words. "It's like they're becoming more real," Isabella suggested, having observed the same phenomenon, more true to what glass should be. Gabriel examined a pair of spectacles that a particularly insistent visitor had left behind as a bribe. The crystal lenses had begun developing patterns that shouldn't have been possible. Subtle spirals and curves that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "The crystal remembers," he said quietly. "Not the power we unmade, but something old. Something that was there all along, before we learned to twist it with supernatural craft." He handed the spectacles to Miguel. "What do you feel?" The apprentice held them carefully, his fingers tracing the emerging patterns. "It's like they're trying to tell a story, not with words or pictures, but with their own nature." His eyes widened. "Is this what you meant about a crystal having its own voice?" "Partly," Gabriel nodded. "But there's more. Dr. Wilson, what does your scientific mind make of these patterns?" The young scientist adjusted his own spectacles, studying the lenses closely. "They're not random. There's a mathematical precision to them, but it's not any geometry I've studied." He pulled out a notebook, sketching rapidly. "Look here. The curves follow the same ratios we see in natural growth patterns. Shell spirals, leaf arrangements, the way crystals form naturally." "The language of creation itself," Sister Catherine said from the doorway. She'd come to discuss the church's new rose window, but found herself drawn into the conversation. Not the words of power you used to use, Mr. Martinez, but the grammar that underlies all things. Isabella, who had been grading papers at her usual corner of the workshop, looked up thoughtfully. Is that why my students' drawings have changed? They're not just pictures anymore. They're full of patterns that seem to mean something, even if we can't quite read them. Gabriel picked up his glass cutter, studying its worn handle. When we unmade the reality-warping power, we didn't destroy the underlying truth it had twisted. We just let it return to its natural state. He smiled at Miguel's confused expression. Like a working crystal, you can force it into shapes that defy nature, or you can help it become what it was always meant to be. Thompson, who had taken to visiting in the evenings to discuss his work at the church, added his own observation. The windows we've been crafting, people say they feel different when they catch the light. Not supernatural, just real. More real than ordinary glass. Because you're working with the crystal's nature now, not against it, Gabriel explained, understanding it instead of trying to dominate it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Hawkins, looking troubled. Got word from the territorial marshal. Drake isn't just a wealthy industrialist. He's been buying up every old glassworks he can find, especially ones with unusual histories, looking for traces of the old craft. But finding something else instead, Gabriel mused. He described the strange behavior of the visitors' eyeglasses and spectacles. Hawkins nodded grimly. That's not all. The marshal says wherever Drake sets up his operations, strange things start happening. Not reality-warping chaos like before, but changes. Glass objects developing unusual patterns, lenses that work better than they should, mirrors that seem to show more than just reflections. Dr. Wilson leaned forward eagerly. A natural phenomenon emerging to fill the void left by the supernatural. Craft, fascinating. We could study it, document it. Or, Gabriel interrupted firmly, we could let it be what it is. Some things need to grow in their own time, their own way. He turned to Hawkins. Still, keep an eye on Drake. Men like him have a way of trying to force nature's hand. The sheriff departed, leaving them to ponder this new development. Isabella's students could be heard in the schoolyard, their games now incorporating complex patterns that seemed to mirror the ones appearing in glass across the town. Mr. Martinez, Miguel asked suddenly, if the supernatural craft is gone, but the crystal still remembers, what are we really learning here? Gabriel picked up a piece of raw glass, holding it so his apprentice could see how the light played across its surface. We are learning to listen, boy. Not to words of power or blessing patterns, but to the crystal itself. To understand what it wants to become. Not what we want to force it to be, like the way you knew that church window needed more sand in the mix, Dr. Wilson interjected. Not from any formula or supernatural insight, but from... He waved his hands, searching for the right words. From paying attention, Gabriel finished. From respecting the materials and the craft enough to let them teach you their nature. He began heating glass in his furnace, his ordinary furnace now, but somehow no less magical for its simplicity. As the material began to glow, they all saw it. Patterns in the heat, in the way the glass took the fire, in how it responded to Gabriel's skilled hands. Not supernatural manifestations, but the subtle language of the craft itself, speaking to those who had learned to listen. Sister Catherine crossed herself, but her expression was one of wonder rather than fear. Perhaps this is how it was always, meant to be, not power that breaks the world's laws, but wisdom that helps us understand them better. The evening deepened around them, and in Gabriel Martinez's workshop, a new kind of craft was taking shape, one built not on supernatural power, but on the deeper magic of skill, understanding and respect for the true nature of things. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Drake's spectacles kept time with rhythms older than human reckoning, their crystal remembering truths that no amount of ambition or wealth could ever truly possess. Sister Catherine entered carrying news from her contacts in other parishes. "The effects are spreading," she reported. "Every glassworks Drake buys, every factory he converts, they become nexus points for these changes. The crystal remembers more strongly there, speaks more loudly, and not always kindly." Thompson added, "I've heard stories of machines turning on their operators, of molten glass flowing against gravity, of factories where the laws of nature simply stop working." Gabriel picked up his glass cutter, a simple tool that had never been enhanced by supernatural craft, but had shaped crystal true for decades. Because Drake and his kind don't understand. They see the patterns emerging in the glass, the way it remembers its true nature, and they think it's just another resource to be exploited, but it's fighting back. "Not with chaos like before," Miguel said suddenly, understanding dawning in his young face, "but with truth, showing us what happens when you try to cage nature's voice in machines." A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Drake's men had arrived, not a businessman this time, but a worker from his nearest facility. The man's clothes were stained, with crystalline residue that seemed to move of its own accord, and his eyes held a haunted look. "Mr. Martinez," he gasped, clutching the workshop's doorframe. "You have to help us. The glass, it's awakening. Not like you said it would, not natural and slow, but..." He held out his hands, which had developed a glassy sheen. Drake pushed too hard, tried to force it, and now Gabriel examined the man's hands carefully. The crystal wasn't corrupting him like the military site had corrupted its creators. Instead, it seemed to be teaching him, but too fast, too forcefully, like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. "How many others?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Dozens and more every day. The machines, they're changing too. Not just working better than they should, but..." The worker shuddered. "They're starting to work together with purpose, like they're building something we don't understand." Dr. Wilson was frantically taking notes, but Isabella noticed something odd about his paper. The ink was arranging itself into familiar patterns, the same ones they'd been seeing in the glass. The natural world was speaking through every medium it could find, trying to warn them. "We have to stop him," Hawkins declared. "Drake's factories are already stopping themselves," Gabriel interrupted, holding up Drake's spectacles. There, crystal had aligned into a pattern that pointed directly at the largest nearby facility. "The question is whether they'll stop cleanly or take half the territory with them when nature finally loses patience." Sister Catherine clutched her rosary, which had begun developing the same swirling pattern seen in the glass. "What can we do?" Gabriel turned to his grinding wheel, his simple, honest wheel that had never tried to be more than it was. "We remind the glass of its true nature, not with supernatural craft or industrial greed, but with understanding, with respect." He began heating crystals, his movements precise and reverent. "We show that some of us still remember the right way to work with nature's voice." The winter wind howled outside, carrying the sound of distant factories where glass was awakening to its own power, its own purpose. And in his workshop, Gabriel Martinez prepared to teach one final lesson about the difference between mastering nature and working in harmony with it. Miguel's training had taken an interesting turn. Without access to supernatural craft, he had developed an almost uncanny intuition for crystal's natural properties. His work showed a precision that went beyond mere technical skill, a deep understanding of how materials wanted to behave. "The glass still speaks," he explained to Dr. Wilson one day, "working on a complex lens. Not with magic anymore, but with its own voice. You just have to learn to listen differently." Sheriff Hawkins had her own adjustments to make. The jail cells that had briefly held reality-warped prisoners now housed ordinary criminals, but something about the space had changed. Inmates reported strange dreams, moments of startling clarity about their lives and choices. "It's like the walls remember," Hawkins told Gabriel. "Not the chaos from that night, but the return to order. Makes people think about their own need to set things right." Thompson, recovered from his burns and no longer a prisoner, had begun helping Sister Catherine restore the church's stained glass. His hands, once burned by corrupted power, now found healing in crafting simple but beautiful things: window frames, altarpieces, lanterns for evening services. "Each piece is a kind of penance," he explained to Gabriel when his former master came to inspect the work. "Not trying to grasp power anymore, just trying to add some beauty to the world, to make up for what I almost helped destroy." But not all changes were peaceful. Word had spread about Serpent Pass's Glassmaker, distorted tales of the confrontation with the reality-warping site. Other craftsmen began arriving, drawn by rumors of lost knowledge and hidden power. One morning, Gabriel found a man waiting at his workshop, a wealthy industrialist named Victor Drake, who had made his fortune manufacturing optical instruments back east. "I know what happened here," Drake declared without preamble. "Not the sanitized military report or the local legends. I know about the craft, Mr. Martinez, and I believe some fragments of that knowledge must remain." Gabriel continued his work, carefully polishing a simple lens. "Believe what you want, Mr. Drake. Knowledge that's meant to survive survives in its own way, in its own time." "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer," Drake pressed, "for any remnants of your special techniques, even incomplete knowledge, would be invaluable." Gabriel led Drake to the back of his shop, where rows of finished pieces stood on display: window panes, drinking glasses, simple prisms, and children's marbles. "See these?" Gabriel gestured to the items, made with skill, patience, and understanding of the crystal's nature. No supernatural craft, no reality-warping power, just honest work that helps people live better lives. As the days passed, strange events continued to unfold. In the outskirts of town, small fragments of discarded glass began to glow faintly under the moonlight, whispering in frequencies beyond human hearing. Fishermen by the river reported seeing reflections that showed not their own faces, but glimpses of forgotten pasts. And in the depths of Drake's largest factory, something was stirring, an intelligence growing within the glass itself, waiting, watching, learning. Gabriel Martinez had spent a lifetime working with glass, and he understood better than most that true mastery lay in listening rather than commanding. Yet what was happening now, what Drake had set into motion, was something even he had not foreseen. The glass across Serpent's Pass was not just remembering, it was awakening. In the days that followed the workers' warning, reports poured in. Windows in Drake's factories distorted reflections in ways that defied physics. Lanterns, meant to illuminate workshops, instead cast shadows that whispered and shifted on their own. Glassworkers found their tools behaving unpredictably, blades sliding along invisible seams they had not cut, flames bending around molten forms as if sculpted by unseen hands. At first, Drake dismissed these as wild exaggerations, but as more of his employees fled, leaving behind half-finished optics that refracted unnatural light, even he had to acknowledge that something was very wrong. "We need to see it for ourselves," Sheriff Hawkins declared, "before it gets worse." Gabriel, Miguel, Isabella, and Dr. Wilson accompanied Hawkins on the trek to Drake's largest facility. The structure loomed against the twilight, its upper windows reflecting the darkening sky in unnatural hues. Even from the road, the air shimmered with the presence of something neither alive nor inert, neither supernatural nor entirely mundane. Inside, the great furnaces still burned, but their flames no longer obeyed their masters. Sheets of unfinished glass had fused into a single vast pane that stretched across the ceiling, refracting light into dazzling, ever-shifting constellations. The workers who remained stood transfixed by the display, their eyes reflecting the swirling patterns as if absorbing something beyond sight. Drake was there, pacing furiously, his usually impeccable suit coated in flecks of molten crystal. He rounded on Gabriel as soon as they entered. "You did this," he accused. "Your refusal to share what you know forced me to dig deeper, to experiment, and now look." He gestured at the massive living glass above them. "It's out of control." Gabriel examined the transformed factory floor, his expression unreadable. He reached out and brushed his fingers over a nearby work table, where a shattered lens had reassembled itself into an unfamiliar yet perfect form. "This isn't control or chaos, Drake," he murmured. "It's something else entirely. The glass is remembering, yes, but now it's learning." Miguel turned to Gabriel, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then can we teach it?" For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sister Catherine, who had joined them despite her misgivings, stepped forward, gripping her rosary. "If we don't, who will?" Drake scoffed. "And how do you propose to teach something that doesn't think like us?" Gabriel exhaled, feeling the weight of years pressing upon him. "We don't teach it to think like us. We teach it to be what it was meant to be." He turned to Miguel. "Gather what tools we have. We'll work the glass, not force it, not shape it against its will, but guide it, show it harmony, not exploitation." Miguel nodded and moved swiftly. Isabella, despite her skepticism, began arranging tools and materials, while Dr. Wilson took meticulous notes, eager to understand this phenomenon. Hawkins and Sister Catherine watched over them, prepared to intervene if the living glass turned hostile. Drake hesitated, torn between his ambition and the undeniable realization that his approach had led to catastrophe. Finally, with visible reluctance, he removed his own spectacles and set them on the work table. "Fine," he muttered. "Show me." For hours they worked, not in defiance of the awakening force, but in cooperation with it. They traced old patterns, not spells or sigils, but the natural curves and ratios found in shells, in rivers, in the way fire itself danced. The glass responded, shifting, settling, harmonizing. As dawn broke, the once chaotic pane above them had stabilized, its swirling forms now locked into a vast, luminous mosaic. The distorted reflections had ceased their erratic shifting, instead offering clear, true images. The machinery, once rebellious, stood silent and still, as if waiting for a purpose. Gabriel stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. There, not tamed, not conquered, just understood. Drake picked up his spectacles and looked through them. The world beyond was unchanged, but somehow clearer. He swallowed hard. "So what now?" Sister Catherine smiled. "Now we learn to live with it." And so Serpent's Pass changed. The factories did not close, but neither did they operate as they once had. The workers no longer fought their materials. They worked alongside them, creating glass that held not magic but something deeper, an honesty, a resonance with the world itself. As for Drake, he did not leave, nor did he return entirely to his old ways. He studied under Gabriel for a time, learning not the secrets of supernatural craft, but the quiet power of understanding. Whether he accepted this lesson fully or merely bided his time remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the glass had spoken, and for the first time in a long while those who shaped it were willing to listen. Yet the story did not end there. Weeks after the factories had settled into their new rhythm, reports of something new began to surface. Travelers spoke of strange, luminous figures glimpsed in the reflections of shop windows and riverbanks. Fishermen claimed their nets snagged on unseen currents in the water, twisting their paths in intricate, almost deliberate patterns. And in the deepest halls of Drake's factory, there were whispers, soft, melodic, like wind chimes moving without. "A breeze." Gabriel watched these changes with a quiet, knowing gaze. "The glass is still listening," he murmured to Miguel one evening. but now it wants to speak. As the days stretched into weeks, Serpent's Pass found itself settling into an uneasy balance. The glass had been guided, not forced, understood, not controlled. Yet in the wake of this fragile peace, the town could not ignore the lingering question. What did it mean for the glass to speak? One evening, as Miguel was locking up the workshop, he caught sight of a flickering glow in the reflection of a nearby window pane. At first, he assumed it was the light of a lantern, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The glow remained only in the glass. He leaned in closer, and for a fleeting moment, a figure appeared. Not a person, but a shape made of refracted light, shifting and rippling like a prism catching the sun. "Gabriel," he called, stepping back. Gabriel emerged from the workshop, wiping his hands on his apron. He followed Miguel's gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, he retrieved a polished shard of glass from his workbench and held it up to the same window. As the shard aligned with the larger pane, the glow intensified, coalescing into something almost recognizable. Not a reflection, but a memory imprinted within the crystal itself. The image wavered and twisted, revealing glimpses of past moments, scenes. From the old glassworks, faces long gone, hands shaping molten glass into delicate forms. The glass was speaking, showing them not the future, not even the present, but the echoes of everything it had ever seen. "It remembers more than we thought," Gabriel murmured. News of the phenomenon spread quickly. Travelers and scholars arrived, eager to witness the glass's strange recollections. Some saw only scattered images, while others, particularly those who had worked with glass their entire lives, found themselves immersed in entire sequences. Not just images, but experiences, as if the glass was imparting knowledge directly to their senses. Dr. Wilson, ever the researcher, took meticulous notes, attempting to document patterns in what the glass revealed. "It doesn't seem random," he mused to Isabella. "It's selective. Some see only fragments, while others get entire stories. What determines who sees what?" Meanwhile, Sheriff Hawkins kept a wary distance. "Memories in glass are one thing," she muttered to Sister Catherine. "But some of my deputies claim they've seen figures move in reflections when there's no one there." And then, one night, something changed. The town square's grand stained glass window, once restored by Gabriel and Thompson, suddenly pulsed with light at the stroke of midnight. The shifting colors cast swirling patterns onto the cobblestones, forming symbols no one recognized. The few who witnessed it spoke of an unmistakable presence, something watching, waiting. Gabriel stood before the window the next morning, running a calloused hand over its surface. He could feel the warmth, the stored energy humming beneath his fingertips. "It's not just remembering," he said softly. "I'm trying to communicate." The implications were staggering. If the glass had learned to remember, if it had begun to recognize patterns beyond human understanding, then what else might it be capable of? What might it say if only they could learn to listen? Miguel, standing beside him, exhaled slowly. "Then I guess we'd better start learning its language." As the days went by, more and more people reported strange occurrences. Shopkeepers claimed their display cases rearranged themselves overnight into more aesthetically pleasing compositions. Children playing near the river discovered small glass pebbles that glowed faintly when held, each containing an image or whisper of the past. Even the town's church was not untouched. Sister Catherine found the rosary beads on the altar subtly shifting, aligning themselves into patterns resembling the symbols on the stained glass window. She hesitated before mentioning it to Gabriel, but when she did, he only nodded. "It's learning in ways we can't predict," he said, "but it still isn't clear what it wants to say." One night, the answer nearly came. A storm rolled in, lightning crackling through the sky. As the first heavy drops of rain struck the glass structures in town, something remarkable happened. Every pane, every shard, every reflective surface shone with internal light, forming a vast, interconnected web of patterns across the town. The storm winds howled, yet the glass hummed in response, resonating like a massive instrument being tuned by unseen hands. And then, just for a moment, every single glass surface spoke at once. Voices overlapped, a cacophony of whispers and cries, songs and shouts, thousands of words in countless tongues. It was overwhelming, incomprehensible, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The storm passed, the light faded. Gabriel and Miguel exchanged a look. They knew now, without question, that the glass had something to say. The only question was whether they would ever learn to understand it. In the days that followed the storm, the town of Serpent's Pass was left shaken, yet undeniably changed. Though the voices had ceased, an afterglow remained, an awareness that something vast and unseen hand brushed against their world, leaving echoes in its wake. Gabriel spent his waking hours studying the glass, running his fingers over its surface, listening not with his ears, but with the instincts honed over a lifetime of craftsmanship. Miguel, ever curious, kept a journal of every oddity they encountered, reflections that shimmered with unsaid words, patterns forming in windows at dusk, the way the river's surface sometimes showed not the sky, but the swirling, luminous depths of something beyond. Dr. Wilson devised experiments to quantify the phenomenon, measuring the pulses of light and the residual heat left in panes of glass that had spoken. "There's a rhythm to it," he told Isabella one evening, poring over his notes by lantern light. "It's not just random. If we can find the pattern, we might be able to respond." Meanwhile, Drake watched from the shadows of his office, restless. He had spent his life bending glass to his will, forging industry from molten sand, but now the material had taken on a will of its own, and despite everything, despite the warnings, he still wondered, could it be controlled? Sheriff Hawkins remained wary, patrolling the town at night, hand hovering over her revolver whenever she passed a mirror that seemed to ripple just beyond the edge of sight. Sister Catherine continued her quiet prayers, but now she found herself listening more than speaking, as if expecting the glass to whisper back. Then one night the message came. It started with a single pane in Gabriel's workshop, its surface trembling like water touched by a distant sound. Then another window, joined, then another. Soon every piece of glass in town resonated, casting fractured patterns of light onto the streets. People gathered, breathless, afraid, enthralled. And then the images began. They weren't memories this time, not glimpses of the past, but something else. A vast city of light and glass rising from shifting sands. Towers that bent and curved like living things. People, not human, not quite, walking among them, their forms elongated and shimmering, as if made from reflections themselves. The vision flickered, skipped like a heartbeat, then resolved again. A figure stood at the center of it all, watching, waiting. And then the message came, not in words, but in understanding. A door had been opened, not by them, not by Drake's ambition or Gabriel's guidance, but by time itself. The glass had always been listening. It had always been remembered. And now, after centuries of silence, it had found something or someone to speak to. Miguel swallowed hard. "What does it want?" Gabriel exhaled slowly, staring at the vision before him. "I don't think it wants anything." His voice was quiet, awed. "I think it's asking." The realization settled over them, like a dawn breaking over the sea. This was not a force to be tamed or feared. It was an intelligence reaching out, searching for understanding, just as they were. Drake, standing at the back of the gathering, clenched his fists. "And what happens if we answer?" Gabriel turned to him, a knowing glint in his eye. "We learn." The vision flickered once more, then vanished, leaving only darkness and the hushed breath of the town behind. The glass settled, its whispers fading, waiting, and for the first time in history, the people of Serpent's Pass truly listened. The days that followed were filled with debate and discovery. Scholars arrived from distant cities, eager to decipher the lingering patterns left in the glass. Craftsmen worked alongside Gabriel, shaping new lenses and mirrors, testing how the awakened material responded to different hands, different intentions. One evening, Miguel held up a newly forged pane, carefully polished to perfection. As he gazed through it, the air beyond seemed clearer, more vibrant, as if the world itself had been subtly enhanced. "It's changing us," he murmured. Gabriel nodded. "Or perhaps it's simply revealing what was always there." Sister Catherine, standing nearby, clasped her hands. "If the glass is asking, we must decide how to answer. Do we guide it, or do we let it guide us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The people of Serpent's Pass stood at the edge of something new, something vast. And as they looked into the gleaming, pulsing reflections all around them, they understood one thing: their story was only just beginning. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.